Ladies and gentlemen, people everywhere, welcome to this week's episode of Property of the Week with PropertyLens. For those of you who don't know, I'm Bob Frady, CEO and co-founder of PropertyLens. With me,
John Sigmund, president and co-founder of PropertyLens.
So, John, everybody accuses insurance people of being like old as fossils, and we're turning that on its head this week by bringing in the CEO of Faura, Valkyrie Holmes. Valkyrie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, you guys, for having me. My name is Valkyrie Holmes, and at Faura, we help people understand property risk from this lens of survivability. So kind of fitting property and lens into that description there, but everything that we do surrounds this idea of, is this property going to survive the next disaster if it does come in contact? And this differs from a traditional climate model in the fact that we're analyzing an individual asset as opposed to getting a general sense of risk from climate data. So we're looking at building materials, conditions, any resilience characteristics on the property to get a sense of not only what the risk is currently, but these are the things you would need to do to reduce your risk in the long run in reference to that specific disaster. So we do that for 5 different perils all across the country, mainly working with insurance companies to help them understand their risk. And then on the policyholder side, if you know what you need to do to reduce your risk, typically there's some kind of insurance benefit in it for you. So that cycle is something very interesting to us that we try to maintain.
How does it work? Does someone get denied insurance and then they get your stuff and they fill it out, or what's that process look like?
Yeah, so we plug in at a couple different points of the process. So let's say you're an underwriter and you're looking at a property for the first time. We would have a Faura survivability score that gets sent to you based off of any data that we receive about the property. So that's either you as the underwriter sending us an address and we source it from our vendors. You could give us raw property data. Maybe it's like characteristics you already have from previous inspections. But either way, we're analyzing that property. This can be for a new business application or an existing customer in that renewal process. And so you as the policyholder would basically get a text whenever an underwriter looks at that property and tries to get more information about what the actual survivability rating is. So that could be upon new business when you're applying with a new carrier. That could be on renewal. That could also be when your policy was potentially denied or put into this period of waiting where you have 30 to 90 days to fix a bunch of things on your property. And so our role there is to teach you about the risk on your property so that you can then make the changes to qualify for that insurance policy. So it kind of works, a bunch of different theirs.
So does the homeowner walk around with a camera and take pictures, or does someone come out and do an inspection? How does that part work?
Yeah, so we have a couple different tools that work with our clients. So the first one is kind of what you mentioned as a digital inspection tool. So the policyholder gets a text with a link. So it opens up on their device. There's no downloads necessary. And then they walk around their property and take pictures, videos, and answer any questions to give us the information we need to calculate a survivability score and generate a report. So that's pretty self-explanatory. We have examples and explanations for why we're asking questions in the first place and how that correlates with your risk. And then at the end, we give the policyholder action items and products, services, resources in their area that can help them reduce their risk. So it's really meant to be a streamlined process for a policyholder to have everything that they need to take that next step. And then we have a couple other tools that are purely more on the underwriting and loss control side. So it's you ping us with an address and we give you a preliminary survivability score based off of both on the ground and aerial imaging. And so that way we can kind of use it as a filter and a step-by-step process to get people more accustomed to the idea of survivability on a structure instead of a bunch of manual property characteristics.
All right. Here's the part where we take an address and we run it through our system. And we say, here's the report. Now, normally you go into the site and you put it all in there and it's very, e-commerce oriented. We're skipping that part. Valkyrie sends us an address of 424 Belterra Lane in Big Fork, Montana. The most interesting thing here is the property use code is actually agricultural, but it does have a residence basis to it as well. It's 2,400 square feet. And our PropertyLens reports are good for 120 days. So you have 120 days from here to view this report, and then we'll just save it as a PDF. So what we do at PropertyLens is we take thousands of data elements and we run it through a series of rules and some AI to say, what should I know about this property? And John, why don't you lead us through the buyer's lens and tell us what you see on here?
Well, not too surprising. It's in Montana. The wind comes sweeping down the plains, so to speak. And so there's a couple of wind events. Roof is in great condition. Why are we looking at this property?
Yeah, I mean, this is a property that we pulled from our database that was run through both our quick assessment scores and our general digital inspection report. So when we collect information on a property, we're gathering information not only against one disaster, but we're gathering it to measure survivability across all 5 that we typically look at. So we did a report for wildfire, hurricane, hail, flood, and earthquake. And the biggest thing on this property that we wanted to understand was not only is the roof in good condition and is that going to be something that we have to worry about moving forward, but also from the foundation of the property and vegetation on the property, what does that use? How can we use that to indicate increased or decreased survival for the carrier? So for this property, it was a pretty standard kind of collection of information, but yeah, curious to see what you all find as well.
Okay, very cool. We're so used to having people give us their houses, and it's like, I don't think she lives in Montana. All right.
Not currently, no.
Okay. So anyway, the roof is in great condition. Speaking of roofs, we think it's about 9 years old. It's got 21 years left, given that it's a shingle roof in Montana. So if you were in the process of buying this house or wanting to buy this house, it would be something that, yes, if you live there 20 years, you'd have to deal with. But if you didn't, most likely not. It's in a place that gets cold and snow and all sorts of good stuff like that. So anytime you have that, there's always the opportunity for ice dam buildup and things like that. So you'd want to definitely take a look at the insulation levels of the house to make sure that the roof itself doesn't heat up unnecessarily to prevent that from happening. Same is true for walls with frozen pipes. Those things happen there. High risk area for wildfires. Most people don't think of Montana as a place for wildfires because not a lot of people live there, but plenty of acreage every year in Montana definitely succumbs to wildfire. It has an unfinished basement, so you'd want to take a look at potential for basement flooding, foundations, cracks, all sorts of things associated with a basement. Also, this part of Montana has high radon exposure. So is there a radon mitigation system? How recently was the house built? Newer homes tend to be tighter in their builds, so they don't allow for natural release of the gas and require a mitigation system. And then, it's in Montana. There's this thing called Yellowstone up there that's known for geysers as well as earthquakes and things along those lines. So it's definitely susceptible. Water heater, property is 9 years old. So the water heater is probably reaching the end of its normal lifespan. Fireplaces, is it a gas fireplace where there are minimal concerns, or is it wood burning where there are maximal concerns? And there are no fire hydrants around it. It's, a rural property that's totally expected.
So I'm looking at this, and the question I have is, are there gutter guards on the roof? For 2 reasons. Number one, to keep tree effluent, we'll call it, leaves and needles out of the gutter. Because in a wildfire exposed area, those are certainly ignition points. And the second is, the gutter guards also help in the wintertime, because if the gutter's not clogged, the water can roll off easier through the gutter system. So does this fit, Valkyrie, with what you've seen about the property?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, some of the biggest things that we saw both from our initial kind of run through and then from our inspection was, we're looking for things that you can't get as much with something like aerial imaging. So is it exactly like things like ventilation? Are the eaves enclosed? Are there going to be things or like vegetation near the property or under a deck that would potentially be flammable material because it is in a wildfire, high risk area or higher risk area. Are windows reinforced, things like that. So from like the general, just like these are things that you should be taking care of on the property or looking into. It definitely lines up. And it's interesting, like about the radon, like that's something that we would not have thought of. But I've definitely heard of that, especially in places on the East Coast. But in Montana, I would not have thought about that as being a potential risk factor. So that's very cool.
That's what we have for buyers. That's designed when you walk into a house that you're looking at to say, these are the questions I want answered before I make an offer on a house. I mean, this is a beautiful house. You might decide to buy it anyway, but at least you know what some of these issues are going into it. Let's say you've already made an offer on a house. The inspector technically works for you. So what you should do is take a list of these questions and give them to the inspector and say, hey, make sure you check these things out, because I want to know that I'm getting the good report and not the report that just gets the deal done.
The inspector lens mirrors to a great degree the buyer lens. So again, the wind, the roof, you're looking at the experience of the ice dams, frozen pipes, high risk for wildfires, unfinished basement, radon. All of these things you would definitely want the person to check for. From a building standpoint, because of the earthquake, are the water heaters strapped? Things along those lines. Keep things from falling over and having bad results. What shape is the water heater in? They typically last 10 to 12 years. You might be able to get, a good distance out of it, or it might be hissing right as we speak and you want it replaced before you move in.
So then the last thing that we have is, what are some of the insurance impacts? Now, the data that you have, Valkyrie, is going to be a little more granular because it's done with the hand inspection. Ours is still a little bit more, these are things that you need to know. So maybe the combination of these two things is really what works well together. From an insurance standpoint, the biggest question is, can you get insurance on this place? Wildfire costs have exploded because reinsurance has gotten so expensive for wildfire-prone areas. So the number one question I would have is, you're in a very high-risk area for wildfires. Can you get insurance for this property? And you want to know that before you make an offer, because your real estate agreement may not have an exclusion for wildfire insurance in that state. In some states it does, in most states it doesn't. So you want to make sure that you get that question answered before you buy. Now the question is, then I can get it. Maybe it's expensive. Are there things I can do to mitigate that risk? That's where you come in. But we're more along the lines of, this is the number one risk for this area. Then we have earthquake. It's excluded in California. I'm not sure about Montana, but it's generally an excluded peril. So do you want to have a special policy for earthquake? It's got fireplace. That increases the risk. The replacement cost is about $491,000, and there's no fire hydrants, which can drive your fire peril cost up because you have to just deal with the water that you have there. So from an insurance standpoint, what else would you think about that maybe we might have overlooked?
From our inspection and our survivability scores for this property, for wildfire specifically, we get around a 56% survivability rate, which is not the highest we've ever seen. It's not the lowest we've ever seen. It's kind of right in the middle there. And with our survivability scores, the higher we go, the better off that property is. So when we break that down into different categories, the exterior and the structure scores are going to be the biggest kind of like indicators of that, especially in wildfire prone areas. So our structure score is definitely the lowest of this property. So that means there's quite a bit of vegetation, either overhanging areas of the property. Maybe it's overhanging the roof. Maybe there's a little bit of dead vegetation near the base of the property. There's also things that we need to take care of in terms of the fact that a good chunk of the property is wood. So the actual foundation of the property is concrete, and there's quite a bit of defensible space, but that's a recommendation that we give as an action item is if there's an option to reinforce wood siding or replace wood siding, or remove any non-combustible materials that are, in that area, that's another thing. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the actual defensible space itself, that's probably the biggest broad recommendation that I would give is trim back your trees, make sure there's nothing hiding anywhere, any cracks in, again, what you were mentioning in the foundation, but also in other areas of the roof that maybe you haven't cleaned off in some areas. And there's definitely more action items that kind of come out of that, but that's probably, from an insurance lens, the biggest things that you can start to act on now that would make the most impact.
People don't pay attention to the stuff until after there's an event nearby. John and I have been in this game a long time. We told everybody Lower Manhattan is a storm surge risk, and everybody laughed at us until Lower Manhattan flooded and all that infrastructure went up in smoke. Same thing with wildfire. We're dealing with the tragedy of Pacific Palisades here, and we've been telling people for years that Pacific Palisades is a time bomb of wildfire risk. But people don't pay attention to it until it becomes localized. Have you seen that people actually undertake these actions to improve their risk, or are they doing it just to sort of check a box?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things that we've seen since launching the company is how frustrated people were before and how much that changes when they have all of the tools that they need at their disposal. So like we were working in communities and HOAs that were trying to get grants for homeowners, and they were trying to educate people, and it was firefighting agencies that would walk around people's homes and do inspections for them and teach them about defensible space. And we saw that and we said, okay, we need that on a national scale. We need that to be way more, way simpler for people to access and for them to actually take action if their local firefighting agency isn't coming to their house for 6 months. You know what I mean? So that was kind of the way that we structured our digital inspection. It was this concept of, okay, if we can teach people about the risk on their property, give them everything they need in this simple report, and then make it variable and get that associated with benefit, that's really where this positive feedback loop circles in. Because, you can apply for a grant that's $10,000 on your property, and then 3 years later, it's exactly the way that it was before, because we need to be able to maintain that, which is exactly what connecting this piece of insurance does to a homeowner that's looking at a property, especially in a higher risk area. So if you're getting an insurance policy that's lower because you trim back your trees once every couple of months, or, like when wildfire season starts to happen, you remove any vegetation that accumulated over the winter, then that paints a much bigger picture, and gets people more of the resources that they need. So we've seen a definite uptick.
Doing this sort of work gives me a much more conflicted relationship with trees. I love trees. They're great. But at a certain point, they become a hazard unto themselves. So then we give you the data itself. So it's the first section is here's the questions we would ask based upon whatever stage you're in of buying the property. But then we give you the data. So here's the property overview. This is the stuff that you would see, same from the MLS type repositories, from the county assessor files, et cetera, et cetera. This is generally very publicly available information. Although people don't necessarily dig into all of the data, it's there. So it is wood siding is the primary exterior material. It is unincorporated area, which comes up with its own risks, like who covers the fire. It's Flathead County. Last listed in 2018, sold in 2019. So we do mine this section of the MLS data for information, because what you tell your tax assessor versus what you tell your realtor sometimes are two different things. It last changed hands in 2019. The taxes have gone up quite a bit in this area, from $3,600 to $4,700 over the course of 4 years, which becomes an affordability problem. Between your taxes and your insurance, they're both going up pretty quickly. How affordable is this house going to be for you if those taxes go up again? We see lots of pictures. It looks very pretty. Beautiful home. beautiful setting. I hope this is 5 feet of concrete padding all around the property, because that would be critical success factor. And yes, lots and lots of trees. What do trees like to do? They like to burn. Okay, then we've put a lot of work into roof age and condition. Roof data hides in multiple places, and sometimes it's in the satellite data, sometimes it's in the permit data, sometimes it's in the MLS data, sometimes it's not there at all, and you have to make an estimated guess. So for this property, John, why don't you walk us through the roof lens for this property?
So the roof lens is telling us 9 years. It's the probable age. The property was built 9 years ago, so it's very safe as far as accuracy. 21 years left on the roof. So roofs have different lifespans depending upon where they're at and what they're exposed to. So all of that is critical. So in places where you've got high exposure from elements, your roof doesn't last as long. You might be even able to take advantage of the warranty on the shingles. In this case, most shingles have 25-year expected lifetime. Here, because of the low exposure, it's actually about 30. And then, for roof replacement, should it come to that, you're looking at about $21,000, which isn't too bad to replace a roof. Then below, you can see the scores, the roof condition. It's an A. It's working its way through the lifespan. It will move into a B and then a C as it gets older and more exposed. But the overall exposure for this roof is fairly low. Tree overhang is also fairly low. There are lots of trees around it, but none of them really overhanging the property. It's a single-story house. Roof area is about 43 square. So all of the key pieces and parts that you would need to know about the roof, vents, exterior, all that contained in the report.
And this was as of December 22nd of last 2024. So it's a relatively recent roof picture. So the satellites fly over, we update all the data. Then we get into damaging events. So we measure wind exposure and hail exposure for a property. And it looks like they've had a couple, not very often. Just you get to some places, they have dozens of these. This is relatively limited, but they did have a hailstorm back in 2022 that was about a 1-inch hail size in July, which was interesting. So that might be a flag to say, take a little bit closer look at the roof, because you have had some hail impact in that area. Property update repairs, which is permit data, not necessarily the most robust permit set. For some places you'll have very, very thick data. In some places you have thin data. For this location, we have a permit that was pulled in May of 2016. We normally have the company that did it, because a lot of times you buy a house and you don't know who to talk to after you move in about work that's been done on the house. So in this case, we just have one, and we use 2 different sources to try to find that. So that's what's available for this location. Homeowner service and property inspections are both futures. Estimated utility costs aren't available at this time from this area, probably because of the rurality of the area. And then here's the risks: wildfire, winter, earthquake, some pollution risk, interestingly. We pull in all the FEMA flood data. This is not in a flood zone. It's not in a 500-year flood zone. Flood insurance is not required if you have a mortgage, nor is it recommended. And we do some work on the back end to estimate how far we are from the actual flood zones, and that would change the recommendation. But in this case, it looks like it's pretty good. So there's the scores for the area. The last wildfire was the Parkwood Fire in 2023 and the Blue Lake Fire in 2021. And what's interesting about wildfire is we did a little work a long time ago that if you're in an F zone, which this location is, you should expect to have to deal with a wildfire approximately once every 14 years. And it's not that you're going to be in a wildfire. It's that you're going to have to deal with one. Either one's nearby, or the roads get closed, or something, or you're in one. So this is something that you have to deal with at least once while you're living in that house for most people. In this case, it was twice in the last 5 years.
For high-risk areas for wildfire, if you're not dealing with it from an evacuation standpoint or it being in your general vicinity, your insurance company will probably be making you deal with it more and more. So you're going to become increasingly more aware of how high risk this wildfire zone is, especially if it's a newer property. Maybe you're used to paying a specific insurance cost and have never had to do any mitigation work on your property because this has never happened to me, or this has never been something that we really ever needed to deal with, which is exactly why a wildfire score in combination with a survivability score makes all the difference. It's really just about the education first, and then being able to use that as somewhat of an advantage when you are living in an area that's highly forested and is known to burn every couple of years.
One of the interesting things about homeowner disclosures is the big giant out in homeowner disclosures is, do you know? And if you bought this place in, say, 2022, you wouldn't necessarily know about the Blue Lake fire. You might know about the Parkwood fire, but you could say it didn't affect my property. So there's a huge out. Having the data that says this is what happened to this area is critical to understanding things that might have happened before the previous owner. So, for example, if it's a flip, there's a lot of flags for flips that we have in the system, but they don't know what the historical data is. We pull in that historical data as well. So not a lot of risk of lightning. Hail risk is relatively low, even though there have been a couple of events. Sinkholes, wind, tornado, relatively low. Radon is the environmental polluter here. So relatively low risks of everything else. Luckily, there's no clandestine drug labs around. Property's pretty far. The nearest clandestine drug lab was in Big Fork, about 3 miles away, but it was a while ago, 2004. From an insurability standpoint, when you run this property through the admitted market rules for the state of Montana, the premiums come out between $1,462 and $2,881, which is, relatively modest for a wildfire exposed property. That's changing rapidly. And the fact that wildfire as an F is something that, not every wildfire model is going to show this as high risk as we do. And, that's okay. And then here's all the data that are used in the roof condition. If you want to get a quote, we offer you the chance to get a quote. Claim history, we don't have claims for this property, not because there haven't been any, but because we might not have the source. And then there are, luckily, no sex offenders within a half mile of this property.
That's because there's nobody within a half mile.
Yeah. There's because there's nobody within. Well, we'll get into that, but our sex offender data shows that there isn't one within 5 miles. Crime is okay. A lot of times in rural areas, you have smaller crimes that are more property oriented. But in this case, it's something that you kind of want to keep an eye out on. And then fire protection, it's
You're on your own.
You're on your own. In this case, you will be lucky if the fire department can actually protect this home in a fire, because it's so far away from stations. And it's not just
volunteer fire departments.
Yeah, it's not just the fact that there's 4 stations within 5 miles, but because of the road network, it takes them 15 minutes to get there. And at that point, you're kind of hosing off the foundation and really just trying to save the structure. And then finally, we put it all in a timeline. So December 22nd was the last piece of information that we had. There was a roof condition report. There was a wind event on the 22nd. Hail. They had a fun year last year. And, a typical thing that you might see in other types of scenarios. So If you were looking to buy 424 Belterra Lane in Big Fork, Montana, what would be your biggest 3 things that you'd look for?
Speaking purely from what we, typically do on the risk assessment side, we've already established that it's a wildfire-prone property. So the first thing I'm going to be looking for is vegetation more generally, but if there's any dead vegetation on the property that hasn't been maintained. So, that's just like on the property in especially that 0 to 5 foot zone, right adjacent to the siding of the structure. That's what I'm going to be looking for first. And that's a really good telltale sign of whether or not this property has been maintained on the inside just as much as the exterior. So that's a really big one. The second thing I would look for is in terms of the actual siding itself and any ventilation / windows that have been, potentially reinforced for wildfire. One of the biggest things that we see is if windows get too hot, if glass gets too hot, then it shatters. And that's a really big telltale sign that a property will not survive if a fire gets too close. So that, along with ember-resistant ventilation, that could be something as simple as replacing the grating with 1/8 inch ember-resistant or Vulcan vents, grating that prevent embers from flying into the property and burning it from the inside out. I kind of put those in the same category of like siding features. And then the other thing is really just maintaining the overall kind of like wooden parts of the property that you can't replace. So I know some people do the flame retardant. If there has been flame retardant that's been used on the property, maybe there is a way for you to reinforce areas. Maybe there's a deck on the property, like there's ways that you can make it so that vegetation doesn't grow within those structures as well. So reinforcing the wood areas of the property and getting more flammable things off of the wooden areas of the property is probably the other thing I would look for structure-wise.
John Sigmund, you are buying 424 Belterra Lane, or you're touring it with the possible desire to buy 424 Belterra Lane in Big Fork, Montana. What are the big 3 things that you're looking for?
Well, I'm glad we identified me as John Sigmund, seeing that there are 29 Johns on this call. So the first thing that I'm going to look for is a radon mitigation system. It's got a radon problem. And so since it's susceptible, if it scores high, does it have a system? Because they're not cheap to install. And, you want somebody else to pay for that. So it would be something that the seller would be required to install. They probably already have one. If they do, when was the last time it was tested? Does it still work? All of those good things. So that would be my first concern. Second concern would be, of course, all the things associated with that Valkyrie mentioned with wildfire. All right. Does it have the boxed in eaves? Is it really set up? How close is the vegetation? But I would be looking for a few other things. Does the home have an exterior whole house sprinkler system? Right? Does it have a backup generator to run the well pump? Because they're clearly not going to be on city water out there. Right? Is there a nearby lake, pond, whatever that you have access to in the case of an event? So, since survivability is really what you're looking for, and you know that you're not going to have all that much support, particularly from the local fire departments because they're so far away, you're on your own. So does it have an interior sprinkler system from a fire standpoint? Does it have an exterior sprinkler system from a wildfire standpoint? And then the third thing that I would probably just take a little bit of concern with, there was an inch wide hail incident. That's the size of damaging hail. How well did the shingles survive? Are there pock marks? Are there breaks in the shingles? Anything along those lines that could possibly cause a leak? Because if you're going to help the ice dam form, with or without gutter guards, there's no reason to give it a little bit of an edge and not have that repaired. So those would be the things that I would be looking for. Were I, for some reason, looking to buy a house in Montana, and this was the one I was looking to buy.
If you watch too many episodes of Yellowstone in a row, this may be your future. Okay. If I were looking at 424 Belterra Lane in Big Fork, Montana, here's what I'd look for. First of all, this house is potentially a trap because it's beautiful. This is the kind of house that you walk into and you go, oh, I love it, without knowing what some of those issues are. The 3 issues I would look for. Number 1, can you get insurance for this location? You not only have wildfire exposure, you're really far away from the fire station. So it's going to take a high rate for insurance on this property. Can you get it, and how much will it cost would be the 2 things I would look for first at this property. The second is wildfire. As we've all talked about, it's in a bad wildfire zone, and you're going to have to deal with it sooner rather than later. So, A, are you prepared to take the steps to deal with wildfire mitigation? And B, what's been done to mitigate that house against wildfire in the past that you can move forward? Maybe the current owners have been great about it. And then the last is radon. Radon is a silent killer. It's the second leading cause of lung cancer in the U.S., and people don't even know what's happening. So get a test, which is not normally part of a standard inspection. Make sure you get a radon test. If it comes back elevated, is there a mitigation system there? Or maybe there's already a mitigation system there. So those are the 3: insurance, wildfire preparation, and radon. But it's a beautiful place. Oh man, I cannot tell you how many times we've talked to people and I just fell in love too quickly and not necessarily gone into it with more of a balanced eye to what the risks are of the property. So, all right. Well, there you go. And if you do buy this property, make sure that you go to Faura and run a risk assessment so you can figure out how to survive that property. Because we give you that sort of high to low risk, and they give you the low to really low risk. So get in there and get all the things. All right.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Valkyrie. How does it feel having a professional sports team named after you?
I'll be honest, I don't even know what you're talking about.
There's a women's soccer team.
So,
the Valkyries is the name of the team. I think they're going to be in soccer. Okay, now I have to wake up.
Yeah, I am not into sports. I don't really know too much about anything sports related, but that's cool if that's true.
Yeah, it's a professional women's, the Angel City Valkyries, I think the Golden State Valkyries. So not only it's like a giant. You should probably be aware of this because people are gonna be like in the sports team, and then you'll have to say go sports, and you say of course they named it after.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's either that or it's music, or now there's like a streamer that's named Valkyrie that I get a lot of the time. So it's everywhere. It follows me.
Yeah, listen, magic follows you. That's how it works. There's no sports teams named the Bobs or the Johns. You don't have that.
Maybe you can create it.
Yeah.
The
Atlantic City Bobs. Yeah, doesn't have that same ring to it. All right, for this week's episode of Property of the Week, many thank yous to our guest, CEO of Faura, Valkyrie Holmes. I'm Bob Frady.
I'm John Sigmund.
See you next time.